The Book of Abraham.
There is simply an incredible wealth of ancient Egyptian and other Near Eastern historical documents that substantiate what Joseph Smith said. He simply could not have guessed correctly so many times. He was actually translating from an ancient text, and he was a prophet of God.
In places where I've had questions about whether Joseph Smith got something right, and I've done my homework, he's never been wrong.
There's enough evidence from Egyptology and from traditions about Abraham that tie into what Joseph Smith couldn't have possibly known, but he hit right on target.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly called the Mormon Church, is unique among other Christian faiths in many respects. One way in which the LDS Church is unique is that it accepts additional books as scripture besides the Holy Bible. These include the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. Within the Pearl of Great Price is a most remarkable text called the Book of Abraham. It purports to be a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt. The Book of Abraham has a curious and complicated history. While Latter-day Saints may be generally aware of how the Book of Abraham was produced, there remains much to explore and understand. Where did the Book of Abraham come from? How did Joseph Smith get the Egyptian papyri that he translated? What is the relationship between the papyri and the text of the Book of Abraham? What happened to Joseph Smith's papyri after his death? Have Egyptologists translated the papyri? Do Joseph Smith's translations match the Egyptologists' translations? While accepted as scripture by Latter-day Saints, the Book of Abraham has withstood some vigorous criticism from skeptics since it was first published in 1842 in the LDS Church newspaper, The Times and Seasons. This DVD, produced by the Foundation for Apologetic Information and Research, is aimed to introduce Latter-day Saints and other eager investigators to the history surrounding the Book of Abraham and to answer the questions asked by both believers and critics alike.
In some ways, the story of the Joseph Smith papyri begins with Napoleon. When Napoleon invades Egypt, the Europeans have not been in Egypt really for a very long time, if ever. Not really ever in strong numbers. Napoleon invades Egypt. He brings with him a group of people who draw all sorts of things, both the inscriptions and pictures of the Egyptian monuments, and suddenly Europe is awash with excitement about Egypt. Every European country sends people into Egypt to try and get cool things to bring home. So this is when most of the great museum collections in Europe come out of Egypt, and they're just bringing out as much as they can. And it's during this time period that a man named Lebolo, who works for the French government, and he's finding mummies and papyri and all sorts of other things and exporting them. Part of what he finds are the mummies and the papyri that Joseph Smith will end up with.
These mummies and papyri made their way into the hands of Michael Chandler, who was a traveling showman and antiquities dealer. Chandler toured throughout the United States and exhibited his artifacts to the public for a fee. When Chandler heard that Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, claimed to have the ability to translate ancient records, he made his way to Kirtland, Ohio, then headquarters of the LDS Church and residence of Joseph Smith. Chandler came to Kirtland in July of 1835 and presented to Joseph Smith different papyrus scrolls that were accompanied by various mummies. Upon examining the scrolls, Joseph announced that one of them contained the writings of Abraham, the great biblical patriarch, and another the writings of Joseph of Egypt, who was sold into slavery by his brothers. Joseph Smith and other church members pooled together their money and purchased the scrolls and mummies for $2,400. It is estimated by historians that the church purchased at least 5 scrolls and 4 mummies. Joseph Smith kept the papyri and the mummies in his possession throughout his life, and besides working on the translation of the Book of Abraham, he often exhibited them to curious guests and visitors. After Joseph's death in 1844, his papyri passed through various hands until portions of the papyri were sold to Abel Combs, who in turn sold pieces of the papyri to the Wood Museum of St. Louis, Missouri. Eventually, this portion of the papyri was relocated to Chicago, Illinois, and was unfortunately destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Abel Combs also kept a part of the papyri for himself, and this collection eventually made its way to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The museum kept Joseph Smith's papyri in its archives until 1967, when these fragments were returned to the LDS Church. Among the papyri returned to the church in 1967 included the original source of Facsimile 1 of the Book of Abraham. Since 1967, the remaining Joseph Smith papyri have remained in the custody of the LDS Church. Unfortunately, very little is known about how Joseph Smith actually translated the papyri. There is ambiguity in the historical data that has left historians to question the process of the translation. Joseph Smith himself gave no detailed explanation on how he translated the records, other than to say it was done by the gift and power of God.
How did Joseph Smith translate it? We haven't got any description from any of the brethren of what he actually did.
The funny thing about it is that nobody who was involved in the translation, with the exception of Warren Parrish, said anything about how it was translated. And Warren Parrish, after he apostatized, said that Joseph Smith said it was by revelation. And that's the only thing that we have on how it was translated.
Even if these texts on the papyri would have hinted to the story of the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith might have received a fuller detail of the account, which may not necessarily have been present on the texts. But that's one theory. My personal opinion is that majority of it probably was somewhere in the scrolls that Joseph Smith had.
It was translated by the power of God. That's all Joseph tells us about the translation process. And that's what's been confirmed to me. It was translated by the power of God, whatever that method was.
Many have wondered how old the Joseph Smith papyri are. It seems that Joseph Smith and other 19th century members of the church believed the papyri to be as old as Abraham himself, roughly 4,000 years. This would be the natural assumption, considering that the Book of Abraham purports to be written by the patriarch himself. However, with the rediscovery of the portions of the Joseph Smith papyri in 1967, Egyptologists have examined the papyri and have come to the conclusion that the papyri actually only dates to about 200 BC, to a time in Egypt known as the Ptolemaic era.
Some people are disturbed by the fact that the papyri that we have, we can date to 200 BC, because it says in our text that this was written upon papyrus by the hand of Abraham.
It doesn't date back to Abraham's day. Neither do the manuscripts that we have now for any biblical book. They don't. They're copies of copies. And if I grab on my shelf my Book of Mormon or Old Testament, those were written in the last 10, 20 years.
What these people are misunderstanding is the difference between a text and a manuscript. The text was written by Abraham, and then it was copied again and again and again. It's not going to last forever, and what's more, probably more than one person wants a copy. And so you'll make a copy again and again and again, and so the most valuable texts, we have thousands of years of them being copied over and over again. And when you recopy it, you're still going to write written by the hand of Abraham, because the text itself, the original story, was written by Abraham.
Professor John Gee has identified another Egyptian text, the Tale of Setni, that describes the place in which a book which Thoth wrote by his own hand when he came down following the gods. Professor Gee notes that in this text, the book is said to be written by his own hand upon papyrus, which need not be taken as indicating anything more than authorship. In other words, the phrase, by his own hand, was the ancient way of saying that the text was written by a particular person. As LDS researcher Russell C. McGregor and Carrie Schertz have written, it is obvious from reading the Hebrew Bible that the phrase "by his own hand" is a Hebrew idiom, biyad, which means "by the authority of." In other words, Abraham may not have even touched these documents that bear his name, the very ones that fell into Joseph's hands in the 1830s, since Abraham could have had them commissioned and written for him. Yet for all this, the documents would still bear his signature, since they were authorized by him, by his own hand, even though a scribe may have written them instead of Abraham.
So again, it's the same copy as a copy, so that's not a problem that the text or the documents themselves don't date to that period.
The fact that we have a copy from 200 BC just tells us this has been an important text for a long time. They wanted it to last, so they recopied it, and a number of people thought it was important enough that they wanted their own copies. That's why we have another copy made of this about 200 BC.
Many have wondered how much papyri Joseph Smith had in his possession as he was translating the Book of Abraham. Currently, we only have less than 8 feet of scroll which Joseph Smith possessed, yet both eyewitness accounts and other evidence suggest that Joseph Smith had in his possession much more papyrus than that.
There are a number of indications that we don't have all the papyrus that Joseph Smith had. For instance, we don't have Facsimile 2, we don't have Facsimile 3. We know that there's some that's missing. There's a copy of a fragment in Kirtland of Joseph Smith Papyrus, one of the fragments from Joseph Smith Papyrus 9, that's clearly much longer than what we've got. So there's clearly some papyrus that's missing.
Professor John Gee, Egyptologist, he estimates that about 25% of the Sensen-type text, which is what we have left, about 25% of them had other writings on the back, other type of text, sometimes completely unrelated to what was on the front. And sometimes the graphics that were on the papyri themselves really didn't have anything to do with the text that was on there either.
Well, if the Book of Abraham was on the scrolls, the 19th century eyewitnesses say it was on the long ones. Now, there's a lot of debate over which one is the long one. But if you follow the 19th century eyewitnesses, no matter which one it was, we don't have it because we don't have the long ones. We have the mounted fragments rather than the scrolls.
We've tried to come at this a number of different ways. Recently, John Gee employed a formula that has been accepted and used by Egyptologists where you can look at the fold marks and see how tightly something was wound and estimate how long it was. And he's come up with an estimation from that is about, the scroll was about 40 to 44 feet long.
There's one description by Joseph F. Smith of him seeing his uncle in the Nauvoo house with that scroll unrolled clear through an entire room.
When the roll was stretched out in Joseph's home, it went through long rooms. And so the only mathematical computation that actually matches the historical accounts is the one that John Gee has given us that's estimating around 40 feet long. But we can be clear, based on eyewitness accounts and these computations, that this is a very long roll.
The eyewitnesses say that, who talk about where the Book of Abraham came from, say that it came from one of the long rolls. So that's clearly not on the papyrus we have. And so that's where this missing papyrus theory comes from, and that's the evidence it rests on.
We have, again, only about 5 feet of the 40 feet of the Joseph Smith, the Book of Breathings papyrus.
We can tell from a couple of glue lines that he certainly originally had more than what we have now.
And there's a third papyrus, Book of the Dead, that we have simply a single illustration from. The rest of the papyrus is not there. And I think on those papyri somewhere, the parts that we don't have, critics would say how convenient, but we don't have any originals of the Bible either.
So it seems that Joseph Smith possessed a large quantity of papyri that are now missing. And some evidence suggests that the text of the Book of Abraham was located on this missing portion of the papyri. This would explain why the papyri fragments recovered by the church in 1967 don't translate as the Book of Abraham. In short, the text of the Book of Abraham was located on the longer portion of the papyri that was destroyed. There is also evidence that Joseph Smith translated more of the papyrus than is currently contained in the Book of Abraham. Ensign Call recalled reading the translation of the papyrus in 2 hours. In its current form, the average person can read it cover to cover within half an hour. Other early saints wrote about the contents of the Book of Abraham which contained additional topics, such as information on the Book of Mormon, the lost tribe, the gathering, the end of the world, judgment, and more, which is not currently in the Book of Abraham. Accompanying the text of the Book of Abraham are 3 facsimiles, or reproductions of Egyptian illustrations on the papyri. Joseph Smith published these facsimiles and his interpretation of them with the Book of Abraham in 1842. Facsimile 1 is called by Egyptologists a lion couch scene. Facsimile 2 is called by Egyptologists a hypocephalus, which is a Greek word meaning under the head. And Facsimile 3 has been noted to be related to an illustration from the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
And one of the problems you have with interpreting the facsimiles is that when you find ancient Egyptian interpretations of them, they don't sit down on one interpretation. They'll say a figure can mean one thing and something completely different, and something completely, it's all in the same inscription.
There are some key elements in Facsimile 1 that are completely different than anything else drawn in ancient Egypt. And that tells us something in and of itself. But its closest parallels, when we translate the texts that tell us something about these parallels, a number of them actually have to do with human sacrifice. Some of them are about protecting someone from human sacrifice. Some of them are about sacrificing someone because they've done something they shouldn't have done. Both of these match awfully well with Facsimile 1. And so in the end, while our critics want to look at Egyptian parallels and say what Joseph said was wrong, I'm not sure if we should be looking at parallels, but when we do, they need to deal with the fact that the closest parallels actually match very, very well with what Joseph Smith is talking about.
Ancient sources verify that Abraham was almost sacrificed, that he was saved by God, that he intervened, that he prayed for salvation, and all these things, very, very unlikely that Joseph Smith could have known about them. To get so many of them right just seems impossible based on odds alone.
Another thing that really is fascinating to me is this idea that an Egyptian priest would have a text about Abraham. The ancient owner of Facsimile 1, a guy named Hor, or Horus is the Greek version of his name, he's a priest in Thebes, an Egyptian priest in Thebes about 200 BC. Interestingly enough, we know that he is associated with a ritual that sometimes did involve human sacrifice. So there's another tie between what we know of the papyri and what the Book of Abraham is telling us. But more than that, this priest comes from the time period that we find out they did know something about Abraham.
3 different places on facsimile number 1 it mentions Heliopolis. Heliopolis is Greek for sun city. It was the place where the sun god Re was worshipped. It was a place of special holiness to the Egyptians. And again, I mentioned before that Josephus says that Abraham taught the priests of Heliopolis astronomy. The association of Israelites and Abraham with Heliopolis runs rather deep. So you've got priests, Jewish priests in a temple worshiping Jehovah, offering sacrifices to him in Heliopolis. The point is that there seems to have been a very close connection between Israelites and Abraham and Heliopolis as such.
The things that Abraham is doing and preaching against their gods, and according to some of the other ancient sources, not the Book of Abraham or the Bible, but other ancient sources seem to agree that he does so. He sometimes mocks these gods and even can be destructive to the idols. That's the kind of thing that would have targeted him for this kind of a sacrifice that we find in the text of the Book of Abraham.
For example, the idea that Abraham was, there was an attempt on Abraham's life because he was preaching the gospel, preaching against paganism, idolatry. The Bible says absolutely nothing about that, but there are, again, several different ancient documents that support it, and by several, I mean on the order of hundreds.
And so it's interesting that the text of the Book of Abraham presents us a picture that even 10 years ago, Egyptologists would have thought that doesn't fit with what we know of ancient Egypt. But now we see it's a perfect fit. It weds together absolutely perfectly with what we find in Egyptian history. And the key was that no one had ever sat and looked at it carefully. If we do the Egyptology correctly, it supports what we find in the Book of Abraham.
In the facsimile itself, Joseph Smith gives an explanation of the figures which it contains. Previously, some critics have argued whether he was accurate in his interpretations. But as we learn more about ancient Egypt, there is more we see that Joseph Smith was correct. In Figure 1 of Facsimile 1, it is explained that the bird is an angel of the Lord. This was a common theme among Egyptian writings to portray heavenly messengers as birds. Figures 2 to 4 will be dealt with elsewhere in this video. Joseph Smith explains that figures 5 through 8 in Facsimile 1, which are the 4 canopic jars under the lion's couch, are to be interpreted as the idolatrous god Elkanah, Libnah, Machmachra, and Karesh. Interestingly enough, he was correct in his interpretation, and these were actual gods worshipped in the ancient Near East, despite the fact that the Bible makes no mention of them.
I go through the various linguistic structures that might be present in Elkanah, and then I describe 6 concrete proposals for that word. And the one that I like the best is comes from Akkadian, Il Kanahi, which means El of Canaan. And so that Akkadian name was later represented in Greek in a simplified form as El Kana, Chi, Nu, Alpha in Greek letters. And so this is a name that fits very closely with what's described in the Book of Abraham. And the Canaanites had a cult of child and human sacrifice throughout their history. And that's one of the principal features of the Book of Abraham, is this child and human sacrifice. And so it fits very well with seeing Elkanah as El, the principal god of the Canaanite pantheon.
In Figure 9, Joseph tells us that the crocodile character is the idolatrous god of Pharaoh. Again, Joseph Smith was correct. Sobek was an Egyptian god and was depicted as a crocodile in ancient Egypt. One Egyptian king, whom Sobek was his god, took upon himself the name of Nefru Sobek. Beautiful is Sobek. Unis or Wenis was a king in the 5th dynasty. Utterance 3:17 of the pyramid text says, "The king appears as the crocodile god Sobek." Not only was this an ancient Egyptian god, but it was also the god of the Pharaoh, which is exactly how Joseph Smith described it. Figure 10 is described as Abraham in Egypt. The lotus flower is a representation of a foreigner in Egypt, which is precisely what Abraham was. Figure 11 is explained to represent the pillars of heaven, as understood by the Egyptians. This phrase appears several times in ancient Egyptian literature. Kevin Barney writes, "The Hebrew firmament was believed to be a solid dome supported by pillars. This in turn was closely associated with the celestial ocean which it supported." Figure 12 is Rao Ki Yang, signifying expanse or the firmament over our heads, but in this case, in relation to this subject, the Egyptians meant it to signify Shaumau, to be high, or the heavens, answering to the Hebrew word Shalmaihim. Rao Ki Yang is very similar to the Hebrew word for expanse, and Shalmaihim is correctly translated as heavens. Especially intriguing is a lion couch scene, roughly contemporary to the Joseph Smith papyri that mentions Abraham.
The Leiden Demotic Papyrus, which dates to about the same time frame and again from roughly the same location, It has a lion couch scene, and we don't have the entire portion of the papyrus left, but there is definitely a lion couch scene with the name Abraham right below it. It is associated somehow with that graphic.
In there is a lion couch scene. It's actually part of a love charm. And the text says, it's got a picture of a man on a lion couch, and the text says, Abraham upon his couch.
But some of the things that Joseph Smith that he included in the Book of Abraham that weren't in the Bible included the fact that Abraham's ancestors, including his father, practiced idolatry, the fact that there was a Book of Abraham, or there's writings by Abraham, that's again not included in the Bible itself.
Another fascinating thing is we look at how the Egyptians were using biblical characters. One of the consistent patterns that we will find is that Abraham becomes a substitute for Osiris. And that's interesting because often we think of Osiris being the one who is pictured on a lion couch scene. And so it's not a surprise that in at least one case that we know of, they've substituted Abraham for Osiris on that lion couch scene.
Critics of Joseph Smith likewise contend that the figure on the lion couch is not Abraham, but the pagan god Osiris. However, recent evidence shows that anciently, Abraham was associated with Osiris by Jews and Egyptians. Scholars have argued that an ancient Jewish redactor or editor reapplied Egyptian deities and used them to represent biblical figures. Furthermore, they point out the fact that the ancient Egyptians were not uncomfortable with mixing their own religion with biblical elements.
Kevin Barney is the one who basically proposed this theory, and I think it's a good one. Basically, he surmises that JRED stands for Jewish redactor, and a redactor is an editor of some sort, that in the 3rd century BC, that he would have drawn Jewish parallels, or I guess maybe Jewish thought would have tied it to the vignettes in the papyri.
Under the JRED theory, is that these documents have been repurposed and reimagined and viewed through a Semitic lens. And so they're no longer being presented strictly as Egyptian documents. Now they've been Semitized or Hebraized. And so, so how modern Egyptologists view these documents is no longer the final arbiter for whether the explanations of the facsimiles are correct.
It's very, very possible that the Jews gave these same symbols a very different interpretation. That this scene would have meant something very different to the Jews or to Abraham or any of his descendants than it would have meant to the Egyptians.
And so the JRED theory suggests that a Jewish redactor who had the care of the textual Book of Abraham took Egyptian vignettes or other iconography and in a similar way adapted it as an illustration for his text, which was the Book of Abraham.
So looking at these vignettes, he would have said, okay, this would have could stand for Abraham, this could stand for the creation, this could stand for God, and that we have to understand the Book of Abraham and how it relates to this papyri based on this Jewish redactor.
Some of Joseph's interpretations of the facsimiles are correct. If by correct we mean how modern Egyptologists understand things. And there's this distinction between how the ancient Egyptians viewed things and how modern Egyptologists view them. In theory, those should be the same, but sometimes we do have material from the ancient Egyptians that shows that they saw these things a little bit differently than the way modern Egyptologists do.
And if we start viewing these from how a Jewish redactor would have understood these, not necessarily how the Egyptians of the day would have understood this, that opens up a whole new world, and I think we'll find that Joseph Smith got a lot more things right than we even know now.
It is not uncommon for Egyptian texts to have Jewish scripture accompany it, sometimes even on the same scroll.
You have all through Egyptian history where they have texts from other sources and they mingle them with their own.
There's a prominent example of that. There's a text that dates to about 1300 BC called the Instructions of Amenemope. And this is Egyptian wisdom literature. And it's pretty clear that that text is a source for the book of Proverbs.
You have two account texts that run for the same temple lands. And they're two different papyri. And on the backside of one is an invocation to the Egyptian god Nephthys. And on the back of the other is a copy of the Psalms.
We do know that there are a number of situations where the sense and text or Egyptian documents have things, even chapters of the book of Psalms and other types of things that relate directly to scriptures on them. When these people were buried, they took what documents were important to them and brought them with them. Anything that was pretty much important, they many times buried with them. And so if you had scriptures, or some people think almost like temple recommends, you bury those with you.
You can find all kinds of stuff and put together, and they tend to be published separately because this text is clearly a different topic than this text, so they'll publish this one text over here and the other text over there, and oftentimes you don't know until you piece it together that it's actually on the same scroll.
There were a number of texts on there that could have included the Book of Breathings, the Book of Abraham, and 4 or 5 other texts.
As mentioned before, facsimile 2 is called by Egyptologists a hypocephalus, and a number of Joseph Smith's interpretations are remarkably accurate.
Let's turn to facsimile number 2 and Joseph Smith's interpretations there, several of which have verification from ancient documents, again, that Joseph Smith would not have had access to, that weren't even discovered at his time.
And Michael Rhodes has pointed out that the first part of this phrase, what is in the heavens, on the earth, and in the sea, and in the abyss, is almost an exact translation of the Egyptian words in the left middle portion of facsimile number 2 of the Book of Abraham, figures 9 and 10 in that facsimile, where he has shown the fullness of the whole world and its circle in a picture with 2 sides.
Most scholars agree shows strong Egyptian influence. His description of that judgment of the dead is something we don't find at all in the Bible. He says he could see the souls of the dead being weighed on a scale, and an angel standing by recording the weighing of the souls, the idea being, if you were good, it balanced, if you were bad, it didn't. That is clearly directly taken from the 125th chapter of the Book of the Dead, where the Egyptian concept of the judgment of the dead included weighing not of their souls, but of their heart. In the transformation into a Jewish Christian document, they altered it a little bit. He says the figure at the center of facsimile number 2 is God, seated upon his throne. For the ancient Egyptians, the hypocephalus itself represented all that God had created, the encompassment of God's creations, and God as the creator is sitting there in the center.
Figure 1 is described by Joseph Smith as kolob, signifying the first creation nearest to the celestial or residence of God.
Joseph Smith even says that, or in the Book of Abraham it says that is kolob, because it is near unto God, and it is the center of his creations. The word kolob itself can be associated with a Semitic root found in Hebrew and Egyptian and Arabic that basically means there's 2 nuanced meanings to it. One is to be near, and the other is the center.
There were tiers, and the further up that you went, you had the moon, the sun, the stars, those were all the different tiers, and they moved at different rates, not based on their revolution, but around how they went around the earth. And we read in the Book of Abraham that there's different reckonings, and it's based on those tiers as well. Plus, we know that in Abraham's day, the people believed that the higher you went, the closer you were to God. And of course, the stars were then the closest to God. Well, that's what we learn again from the Book of Abraham, is that kolob is the nearest to God. And like I said, none of this would have made sense from Joseph Smith's perspective, but it all makes sense from Abraham's perspective. And I think it's a big hit to show that Joseph Smith actually was translating an ancient document.
Well, in my mind, the map of the cosmos is trivial compared to how that imagery works in connection with the divine council. Because the star imagery that we see there, from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, links specifically with the concept of the council of the gods, which appears again in Abraham chapter 3 in verses 22 and 23 and through the conclusion of the chapter. The star imagery, the stars are clearly linked with human beings, with premortal human beings from the book of Abraham's perspective. Kolob, for example, the star nearest the planet where God resides. The imagery that is used for Kolob identifies Kolob as a type or figure for Jesus Christ, the being who is nearest to God in his throne, if you will. So the stars in the book of Abraham symbolically link with the concept of the heavenly host, the divine council from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, and serves as a segue or introduction to the divine council imagery that then appears in Abraham chapter 3.
Egyptologists have said that this figure agrees well with the Egyptian symbolism of God endowed with the primeval creative force seated at the center of the universe. Figure 2. The Egyptian god in this figure is holding a symbol of life, which is a symbol of God's power. Joseph Smith says that this figure is holding the key of power. Joseph also explains that this figure corresponds to the plan of God's creations as revealed to Abraham as he was making a sacrifice. This agrees exactly with the Apocalypse of Abraham account. Figure 3 is said to represent God sitting upon his throne, clothed with power and authority. The scepter that this God is holding represents power with the sun, representing a crown of eternal light. In Figure 4, we are told that answers to the Hebrew word raukiyang, signifying expanse or the firmament of the heavens, also a numerical figure in Egyptian signifying 1,000. But what is more interesting is that the hawk god Sokar is depicted on this figure on a ship of the dead. In the Egyptian coffin texts and on a sarcophagus, there is a link between the number 1,000 and this ship. Figure 5 is said to represent a planet that receives its power through the medium of Qliphoth Isis. Haukokabim, the stars represented by the numbers 22 and 23, receiving light from the revolutions of Kolob. Haukokabim is perfect Hebrew, meaning the stars.
He says, for example, figures number 6, or the force, he says, is the earth in its 4 quarters. That's 4 standing figures, with one with a human head, an ape's head, a hawk's head, and so on. They are the sons of Horus, they are called, and among other things, they presided over the 4 cardinal points of the compass, the earth in its 4 quarters. So Joseph Smith is correct in his interpretation of that.
According to Joseph Smith, Figure 7 represents God on his throne with the Holy Ghost next to him in the form of a dove. This is an Egyptian god with a bird next to him. Birds commonly represent spirits in Egyptian writing and would be an appropriate symbol for the Holy Ghost.
There's enough of those that Joseph Smith got right that it's pretty hard to say he got lucky guesses on all of them.
For many of these, the typical scene is Osiris sitting on his throne and the deceased person being brought to be presented before Osiris. And the text will say that he's being brought to Osiris. But what's interesting is that in a number of these, we find, and these are for Egyptians even, we find that instead of Abraham, or instead of Osiris, it says Abraham. The person is being brought before Abraham, who is sitting on a throne. And Facsimile 3 is that typical kind of scene. And so again, we see Abraham being substituted for Osiris in a scene that is typical of what we find in the facsimiles, where many people have said that has to be Osiris, but we find that often it actually is Abraham.
Clearly, again, there's adaptation between the Judeo-Christian writing here and the Egyptian. The god Thoth is transformed into an angel. The heart is transformed into the soul. There are even 4 demons standing by. Demons are something that match up with the 4 sons of Horus again, which are there. The point here is that facsimile number 3 is part of the series of illustrations that are found in the 125th chapter of the Book of the Dead. Facsimile number 3 does not show the actual weighing of the heart. What facsimile number 3 shows is that which occurs after the heart has been weighed. After the heart has been weighed and the person is, and it's weighed in Egyptian against the ma'at, which is truth. And so, and the God Thoth then says, he is true of voice. In other words, he's telling the truth. So you couldn't lie and say, yes, I was really good, and make it into heaven. The Egyptians had that was the way of determining the truth of it. Once it was determined that you were telling the truth, then you were introduced into the presence of the god of the dead, who is Osiris, and that's the scene that we have in facsimile number 3. So, kind of summing up the evidence supporting Joseph Smith's interpretation of the association with Abraham of all 3 of the facsimiles. Facsimile number 1, there's another ancient Egyptian document that shows an illustration similar to it with the name Abraham directly written underneath it. Facsimile number 2, we have the Apocalypse of Abraham that associates the visions of creation that Abraham sees with a circular representation, and we even have wording that is similar to what we find on facsimile number 2. With facsimile number 3, again, Abraham's visions include scenes from the 125th chapter of the Book of the Dead, which facsimile number 3 is one of those scenes from the 125th chapter of the Book of the Dead.
The tying in the right tales of Abraham as far as, his dad being involved in idolatry and in sacrifices, and Abraham being saved from divine intervention after praying and so forth, all of that fits perfectly from the other books or testaments of Abraham that we have found from ancient documents.
Many have wondered if the details described in the Book of Abraham have support from ancient sources. Over the years, new archaeological and textual evidences have come to light that demonstrate the authenticity of the Book of Abraham as an ancient text.
There are numerous ancient documents that have come to light since the time of Joseph Smith, which substantiate and verify a lot of the information that we find in the Book of Abraham that is not found in the Bible.
The text is a more difficult target for the critics because there's some very interesting evidences that support the text. What could Joseph Smith have known about? What couldn't he have known about? There were writings floating around in the country that talked a little bit about Abraham or talked about some of the things that we find in the Book of Abraham, but what is the likelihood that Joseph Smith could have known these and collected all the right pieces from libraries or archaic sources?
So generally, in the way the text is phrased, it has an ancient ring to it. And this is a comment, from a non-LDS Egyptologist. The English text of the Book of Abraham, which is written in a kind of a faux King James Jacobean language, which is common with Joseph Smith's scriptural productions. But if you took it out of that kind of language and you put it in normal, modern Egyptological type of vocabulary, that it would read very much, like an ancient document.
The similarities among all these early Jewish Christian texts and the Book of Abraham, one of the questions that often arises is, did Joseph Smith have access to these texts? Some apocryphal texts or pseudepigrapha texts, some others. Where then does Joseph Smith have access to all of these that even a learned scholar such as this critic didn't even have access to all of these texts.
Where a lot of parallels exist with the ancient world and with Abraham tales and traditions specifically. And so for me, the English text presides a wealth of parallels and evidence for the Book of Abraham.
And just, again, it's another, story of Abraham that we don't get in Genesis. And so it raises the question of, where do these traditions come from? How do they suddenly appear, especially in multiple texts from similar time period? The Apocalypse of Abraham is a really interesting text in comparison to the Book of Abraham, because it seems to have a lot of elements that we see in the Book of Abraham, including kind of a two-part story where the first part talks about Abraham's relationship with his father, which wasn't the best because his father was an idolater, and Abraham didn't feel that that was right.
The Apocalypse of Abraham is an ancient pseudepigraphical work. That means it is basically an ancient document claiming to have scriptural authority, written by an ancient biblical figure, but in fact probably was not. Nonetheless, containing ancient traditions and historical material from that period.
But certainly the Apocalypse of Abraham that has the most, I think, connections with the Book of Abraham, he absolutely couldn't have seen, and even if he had seen a manuscript, all we have is Old Slavonic, and it just wasn't around and wasn't available.
In the Apocalypse of Abraham, Abraham is shown a vision of the world, of the universe, and it's described as being a vision of the universe.
And therefore, I also believe that Joseph Smith was an instrument of our Heavenly Father to bring this scripture record to us.
I believe it primarily from a spiritual point of view because I've received a testimony about it, but my testimony is strengthened from the physical evidences that scholars have uncovered that again show that Joseph Smith got too many things right. It just couldn't have been a lucky guess.
Indeed, the Book of Abraham is a most remarkable book by any standard. It teaches powerful truths about the nature of God, our relationship with Him and His Son, Jesus Christ, and how we can return to live with them someday. The Book of Abraham enlightens us with light and knowledge as we read its pages and apply the principles it teaches. Anyone who is humble, sincere, and willing to honestly look at the evidence will be able to recognize this as they continue to seek truth by study and also by faith.